So, welcome everybody, and thank you again, Professor Steinbock, for being here today.
Thank you.
Today we are recording a session of questions and answers that are being asked during these days. So I will first ask Professor Steinbock a few questions that the community of phenomenologists asked before the video. And these questions will address mostly chapter 1, 2, and 5 on phenomenology and mysticism. Meanwhile, we are connected with the National Autonomous University of Mexico. So Dr. Esteban Marin will take the floor and will ask his students and the people that are together for their seminar other questions, again, based on the video and on Steinbock's thoughts that are coming up now. So my first question for you, Professor Steinbock, comes from Julian Apostolescu. And he asked you what possibility or impossibility does the concept of a vertical giveness name, and what motivated you to develop this concept? So
yes. Okay, yeah, I'll begin with that one. The other questions that he asked, I just want to say, are very good as well, and they have a more explicit response in phenomenology and mysticism. So I'll just pass on to this one. Mm-hmm. Also, regarding the concept of vertical givenness and what it names, that was also addressed, but what motivated the concept, maybe not so clearly. So actually, I'll respond to this one. It was more of an experiential observation originally, and it took place when I began climbing with a friend of mine, his name is Jean-Luc. And he took me climbing, and I said, well, you know, like, why would anybody want to do that? And although I was intrigued by it, and so we went to a rock cliff, maybe, 30, 40 meters. And I stood before this rock cliff, and I was cold, I was nervous. The rock face felt cold, and I started this climb. And he had secured me, with the rope and so on. But nevertheless, I tried to grab myself at this rock cliff. I'm using all my arms, basically overpowering it, trying to overpower it, and I lost. Oh. I lost in the sense that it took me, I don't know how, an hour or more to get up this thing, and I was exhausted by the time I got over the top, and my arms were so tired I couldn't even lift the water bottle. I was just trying to bring it all up. But we stayed out there for days, and then eventually coming back, weeks, and little by little, what was at first unnatural to me became very natural. And I don't really know how it happened, but all of my movements became redefined in terms of vertical ascension. And every little nook and cranny, every little hole became a possibility of basically vertical movement. And I realized I can't try to overpower this thing. I'm going to lose. And it's not even about your arms anyway. It's all sorts of other things, and I was grabbing really tightly to this, I just trying to almost be on the cliff. And, but little by little, all these little movements, it all became warmer. And all these possibilities of ascension just kind of revealed themselves as I became more attentive to them. And they just became pathways to ascend. All these little marks, all these little holes, and more became illuminated, really, as I began to do that, more evident. And then I began to climb this rock face, which was more like a rock face now than a rock cliff, with a fraction of the time, 15 minutes or something like that. And it would seem to me, although they were and then do technically more difficult climbs in a fraction of the time, and would seem no effort, almost felt like no effort. I got up, didn't feel it. And so I no longer had a stranglehold on it, and this space opened up between the rock face and myself, actually, so I was able to be both held with it and apart from it. And it just became this whole reorientation of movement. Mm-hmm. And I noticed, so this was all happening, and I didn't really notice it all happening until actually one time we went back into the city. This is back into Brussels. And I started everything, every little crevice on a building, every little ledge, everything became now a possibility of going upwards. Uh-huh. And so it was they had this city of walking on sidewalks, going up in elevators, going on roads, but now I was oriented vertically, so that, that's why the window sill, the door frame, everything became possibilities now of moving vertically. And now I started always to, be oriented in that way and looked up, but it wasn't really me looking up. It was almost as if I was directed from above toward a possibility of movement. And I just started rethinking all of the way that I have viewed things. And when I was reading the mystics too, their descriptions of those kinds of efforts or non-efforts, but also the ungraspableness, the not ability to control, the dimension of mystery, all these things started opening up. And I found this real resonance with verticality in the sense that I had experienced it, aesthetically, I would say, and their writings, but not just them either. I mean, there were, so the more I started reading it, the more I started using this term, the more I started seeing it everywhere. In Bachelard, for example, he speaks of the vertical, Merleau-Ponty, the vertical. And some of these texts I have in Phenomenology and Mysticism. The poet Auden, he said, let us honor, if we can, the vertical man, though we value none but the horizontal one. And so all these came up. So it just became, I wanted to use that quote, but they wouldn't let me. So anyway. But so I footnote in there. But the point is, I saw these resonances everywhere with the vertical, and it seemed to make sense. It was more than a metaphor. It was an experiential, an existential dimension that it seemed to me to express the spiritual, also psychological, upright posture, all these in psychology and psychopathology, aesthetically, all of this came together. And so that's the reason why I use a sense of vertical givenness.
Well, thank you for sharing with us this experience and having led us into this beautiful realm where literature, philosophy, religion talk with each other. Now I'll move to Professor Drummond's question, in which he asked, so here we are moving slightly toward your book on moral emotions. So he asks, what's the distinctive intentional structure of moral emotions?
Yes, and I wanted to look, just briefly address that question.
Absolutely.
Is the light okay?
It is, for me, yeah.
You know what, I'm going to do what I did last time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry. We have a motion detector in here, and it's just...
I say when there's too much still.
Yeah. So, okay, because what his question implies, although I won't say a whole lot about the distinctive structure of the moral emotions, but it does highlight the issue of evidence with which we began last week, and what outlines the basic project that concerns the phenomenology and mysticism and religious experience. And so just as a quick reminder, I distinguish a mode of givenness with which we're most familiar, called presentation, mainly a noesis noema structure. I won't go into that anymore. From vertical modes of givenness. And there are several vertical modes of givenness that I've named: epiphany, which is a religious dimension; revelation, which concerns the human interpersonal, let's say, manifestation, which concerns what we can call icon or products, objects, that also have a vertical resonance, the possibility of it; exposure, which concerns incarnate existence; display elements, and then the earth as earth's ground, which is disclosure. So those are the ones that I've named, and they all have distinctive structures, all distinctive from this one kind of intentionality, although these are kinds of intentionalities too, although they have different structures. And I think this is what's behind Professor Drummond's question. And so the easiest way to reply is that it's not this distinctive structure that's peculiar to the religious dimension and the let's say moral or ethical interpersonal human interpersonal dimension is not a noesis noema structure. It's not a subject relation to an object, and nor, but this is the main thing, and even Husserl admits this, as I mentioned, but these experiences are not founded in them either, which is to say they do not borrow their relation of sense, to have a relation of sense with that, from what's happening in perception or what's happening in judgment or what's happening in an eidetic, a simple relation with an idea, for example. So they're cognitive, but they're not necessarily epistemic, an epistemic relation as Husserl described those. So what would that mean for the religious dimension? And what I found in my investigations from phenomenology and mysticism, and the particular mystics with whom I dealt, is that there is the experience is given, that means in this sense of the holy, without, as opposed to what we'd find in like a perceptual experience, is given without measure. It's given all of a sudden, experienced absolutely. It's given fully, but inexhaustively, where there's a clarity as a coming from elsewhere, which it is kind of an experience that's not a matter of negotiation. It's not a matter of what gives itself is not a product of what I provoke, as we can find in perception. So already we see differences there. How it relates then to the question of the moral emotions then is, it would be easy to say, well, okay, what I mean by moral emotions are interpersonal emotions. Not necessarily good or bad, but so the interpersonal of a human interpersonal or finite persons. It'd be easy to say, well, okay, there's this one other kind of vertical givenness that's simply different from presentation. Now, I don't want to presuppose, and we shouldn't presuppose that that's the case. I mean, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I found it wasn't the case, and that the moral emotions, also have a distinctive structure that falls within it does have an overarching similarity or overarching essential structure of vertical givenness, because it's not simply dependent upon a subject in relation to an object, and for various other reasons. So they are all similar in the sense they're vertical modes of givenness, but within themselves, within the vertical, they also have a distinctive structure. So even the moral emotions of, let's say, shame or guilt or repentance will have a different structure from epiphany, what I call epiphany in the religious dimension of experience, although they're still vertical modes of givenness. And so how do you determine, this is all I'll say about it, how do we determine that? Well, one way we can look at it, or what are the structures, the temporal dimensions of those experiences? Do they follow along the lines of a presentational one? No. But are they themselves distinct? And what about the relation to otherness? And then, in particular, their modalities. As I mentioned last week, they have a different relation to an absolute oughtness, as Husserl will call it, and that they're the terms of necessity, contingency, possibility, motivation, all of those things, while they are appropriate for a perceptual experience, they're not appropriate because they don't get at these other kinds of, let's say, religious, or in this case, the moral emotions. And so that they're distinctive. They are distinctive because they are neither, just to summarize it, they're neither a noesis noema relation in the way that a perceptual one, and that can be a very dynamic structure, an active-active structure already, constitutive duet, as I've mentioned in the Husserl, as Husserl says. We don't find that in these other kinds of experiences. And they have a different kind of temporality, a distinctive one. That is to say, they are internal to the very experience itself. When we describe that, they have a distinctive relation to, or a unique relation to, otherness in different cases, and then also their modalities and their modalizations, their problems of self-deception, or deception, the problems of confirmation, of so-called testing the experiences, the historical efficacy of the experiences. Those are unique to those series of experiences. Mm-hmm. That's how we would say that they are distinctive. But even within the moral emotions, some of them are going to have, on different layers, different dimensions. And so the structure of shame or guilt or embarrassment will have, which are interpersonal emotions, they have what I call a diremptive. They're a diremptive experience because of this kind of bifurcation that occurs and being thrown back on oneself in the presence of another. Now, that's going to have a different structure from, let's say, hope, even though hope is also a distinctive experience. So just to give one example of how how hope, a simple example of hope would be a distinct from presentation, and then I'll leave it to the next question. Okay. If I hope that to use the example from last week, if I hope that it snows, even though I expect it to rain, if I hope, then I take a very mundane example because I want to make this point. I'm on the one hand directed toward an object in the same way I would be in a perceptual presentation, a perceptual givenness. I hope that something, 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 okay? And it's I who hopes. But what's happening is at the moment I hope, or in and through, or what gives rise to the hope, is simultaneously the givenness of a ground of hope that subtends the I hope that. And that ground of hope is not something I intend. Now, we don't have to specify what that ground is. It could be luck, it could be fortune, it could be God, but I don't say, oh, I'm going to intend a ground of hope, God, so that something will happen. That might be magic, that might be but that's not the experience of hope. The peculiar thing is that hope, in the moment, in the instant that it arises, it doubly opens. A ground of hope is given, in and through which what I hope is now a sustainable possibility. It's not guaranteed. If it were guaranteed, I'd be confident that I wouldn't need to hope. If it were denied, I wouldn't need to hope. But it's given as what I called in the moral emotions as a sustainable possibility. It's sustained, even if objectively speaking, I don't know, everybody thinks I'm nuts, or if they think I'm in denial. If I hope, there's that double structure of a ground of hope that's given that sustains that hope as sustainable for me who hopes. That is already a religious, I would say, in its core, that already has a religious content to it, okay? Because there's a dimension of the dependence, a givenness, and it's not a positing of, but a givenness of some kind of ground that allows me, in my experience, to hope that. So that would be one example of how that doesn't correspond to, it's not founded in an expectation, because an expectation doesn't have that dual structure. I expect it to rain, period. Why? Because of the present and past, and I can say that, but you don't have that same structure with the ground of hope, because it may have never been present or past. If I never have had an experience of my friend breaking out of jail or something, but I hope he gets out of jail or something, or I hope I survive a tsunami if I have never had an experience of that. It's not dependent in the same way. So it has a radically unique structure. And so what we in phenomenology want to do is to examine those particular nuances that concern modalities, temporality, relation to otherness, and so on. And that particular example could be peculiar to religious experience that would have an independent structure. So that's just the example of that.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Yeah, I have plenty of questions related to just this answer, of course. It's such an interesting topic. But let's move to the other question, which was a question of mine, in fact, as well. How can we avoid that mysticism might be flattened to a form of psychologism?
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So there are 2 or 3 ways of getting at this problem. The one would be excuse me. One would be saying, well, is there any way that we can avoid mysticism being disregarded by psychologism? That's one possibility. And then another one might be, how can we avoid that mystical experiences are not mere pathologies or mere objects, mere psychological pathologies or psychological aberrations, or are they? Now that might be a little bit more reading into your question, but it might be related. And so I don't know if that's legitimate interpretation of that. But for the first one, I think it would be the first aspect of this: can we avoid that mysticism, let's say, is not really disregarded through psychologism? Is there any way of looking at that? And that, if that's what, one of the questions, we could say it depends on giving, or at least being open to the possibility that there are experiences that do not conform to a presentational style of givenness. And I'll put it another way now. It would be not presupposing that the dualism between reason and sensibility that was established in the Enlightenment period, that dualism is appropriate. It would be seen that that's not an appropriate articulation of the human person. Why I say that is, after that period, it's not that the emotions, for example, or these kinds of experiences were absent. It's just that they didn't have a rational justification that Enlightenment rationality wanted for. Now, there's a lot of good things about Enlightenment rationality, but what it did was to reduce anything that couldn't fit in that dualism, either so everything in spirit was reduced to something in psychology, or sensibility. Now, from that period, and what I mean experience in terms of reason and sensibility, such that certain experiences are only allowed to appear either only psychologically, or as a product of instinct, and they don't get their full spiritual integrity. That's basically my point. And we can look at different experiences for that, but we don't have to right now. I mean, if that comes up in discussion, but that would be, and so it's a matter of being attentive to the unique structures of those experiences that come available in human experience, without, in the first instance, reducing them to a different register of explanation. So that's in part how we could do that, how we could avoid or how we could take some of these experiences seriously, even though we might have questions about them, without beginning with the reduction, because they don't fit into our presuppositions, not allowing them to approach them in those kinds of presuppositions, which is the virtue of a phenomenological approach. The second aspect I wanted to mention is that I think in relationship, let's say, this is not exactly what you asked, but it's certainly a question I think that's implied, whether mystical experiences might be psychological pathologies or might be simply pathologies. And all I want to say So that I dealt with, I think, in chapter 5 of Phenomenology and Mysticism. But just to develop one strand of that thought, I think it's possible. What we find in the mystics is this hypernormality, this becoming more and more optimal, and these experiences that in a lot of ways transcend concepts to understand those experiences. In their very expressions, we see that in their own lives. What that means is that on the one hand, there's an optimality of experience, that's a kind of hypernormality, as it were, that doesn't conform to other experiences, which means on one level, as a disruption of that experience, it is abnormal, as Husserl would say. But on the other hand, hypernormal because it institutes new norms, or it might be instituting new norms, we don't know. It's also possible that what begins as a genuine mystical experience becomes a pathology for various reasons, and these are all documented in the mystics. So I don't want to say it's either this or that. It could be that possibly something begins as a pathological experience, let's say, a profound disorientation that has a root that's taken up in a certain way as a genuine encounter with the holy. But I think the mystics, we do get clearer examples of experiences of the holy, what they call holy, that become maybe merely pathologies. And so we don't know, because we don't have that kind of third-person access to those experiences, in the case of religious experience, between the individual and the holy, the sacred, or God, or personal God. We don't have that kind of access. So it remains still a kind of question. But nevertheless, we might misinterpret an experience. But this would be for them maybe idolatry or evil. For mystics, that's what it would amount to, and not mere pathology. But it could go into kind of a self-deception, melancholy, as Teresa of Avila points out with the others, maybe I fasted too much and I'm just, hungry. It may not be a genuine experience. So, okay. And then finally, the third point that I wanted to make is that it's not just the problem of, let's say, a psychoanalytic interpretation of these experiences or reviewing things in terms of psychodynamics. There's also in the relation that we find as a religious one, there's also a problem of interpretation, which would be one, I think, of fundamentalism, that wants to have everything clear, not just in terms of psychological categories, but also in religious categories. So it also has dangers within even the so-called religious sphere when one wants to get it all down and master it. And that doesn't have to be in a psychological way or psychologism. It can be in like kind of fanaticism. And we lose the perspective of discernment and want to dispel the mystery. So there's all sorts of ways in which those experiences can be compromised.
Thank you. Great.
Outline.
Excellent. So now I apologize for the questions we didn't address, but we thought that the video addressed them anyway. And I'll give the floor to Dr. Esteban Marin. I hope I'm pronouncing your name slightly close to the real pronunciation, from a National Autonomous University of Mexico. So there will be new questions from Esteban.
Thank you very much, Susie and Steinbock. We have questions. Nacho, do you want to
go first, please? Well, there are a bunch of people over here.
Yes, hi everyone.
Hi. Somebody wants to start with a question?
Well, I have a short question, very short question. We are all very interested in your work, Anthony. As you know, you work here in Mexico, and we keep reading your books and we watch your video. It was this short question. I mean, it seems to us that, I don't know, this is the question, what for a phenomenology of such experiences like vertical evidences in this sense? Because the phenomenology has a sort of scientific task. And it seems to us that this kind of evidence or this kind of experiences go beyond what the science can manage. Therefore, it seems to us that there is a sort of contradiction between this kind of vertical evidences and the very task of the phenomenological enterprise. what do you think?
Yes. Okay. So first of all, thank you. I would say, well, first of all, this might take us going too far back, but what do we mean by the task of a phenomenological enterprise? If we mean the clarification of what gives itself and the structures of those experiences, and in particular human experiences that are given in some kind of first person or maybe second person perspective with evidence, then I think it's quite open. And I don't think we have to interpret science in a very in a restrictive manner. I'm not saying you are. I'm saying we don't have to see it in a restrictive manner. I also think that if phenomenology wants to be transcendental phenomenology, that is, okay, what is that doing? It's looking at essentially two dimensions of description. The what of what gives itself, the what. Also, they're signaled by the what and the how, or by an ontology and a constitutive phenomenology, or another way to put it, identifying essential structures and identifying modes of givenness. And they, Husserl started off by wanting to bracket the question of the what, or ontology, and get right into this how of givenness, which is very useful. He also turned it around and said, well, let's leave ontologies or life world ontologies of different sorts in play and use them as a clue into a questioning of how what gives itself in order to reinterpret those essential structures. And we can find different examples of it that might not be necessary to give right now, but where you would discern new regions or new ontological categories, as it were, new regions of being through a constitutive analysis. And that's a scientific enterprise, I would say, that belongs to Husserl. If we don't mean it in after all, part of his work was a critique of the European sciences and that science, the scientificity of science, if you wanted to say that, or a critique of the reduction of science to the quantification of experience, or in other words, to be real means to be mathematizable. It's a critique of that. So it already opens up what science means in that way. So I would say that the task of a phenomenological enterprise is to give an account of the limits and powers of the human person in terms of those experiences. I think subjectivity is already a limitation to that. You can use that as a general term, but that already weights it in a certain way. And that demands a philosophical anthropology, and that means giving an account of the wide range of human experience. So that's why I would say it does. And to do that means not to presuppose there's only one kind of givenness, which is what I call the presentational style of givenness. And not to presuppose it. We don't want to just start asserting the other kinds either, but in and through different experiences, we can give an account of those different structures.
Thank you. Esteban.
Okay, thank you, Professor Steinbock. I wrote down my question before, so I will read it if it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you claim, if I understand you correctly, that in order to give an account of vertical experiences, it is necessary to abandon the kind of explanations of giveness in terms of presentation or provocation. But at the same time, all vertical experiences, as you describe them, and I think your descriptions are very, very acute, they all seem to be related to intentional objects or states of affairs. For example, revelations point to persons, manifestations point to cultural objects, epiphanies point to the holy or something like that. Wouldn't this mean that their giveness, although not reduced to mere presentation, although it is not reduced, it does entail presentation? And otherwise, I don't know if you can give an example of an experience which wouldn't entail any relation to any kind of presentation or any kind of intentional object that could present
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, okay, thank you. So let me just maybe clarify a little. I don't want to say, first of all, that we should abandon presentation.
Yeah.
But that one kind of givenness does not exhaust our experience. Now, we certainly have a relation to, and I don't want to say that we get rid of this notion of intentionality, but that there are many kinds of intentionalities. That's another way of saying it, many kinds of givenness. And nor do I want to say that these other vertical modes of givenness are non-cognitive. They're cognitive, but they're not in an epistemic cognition. And so, I mean, I'm not saying anything new here. This is something Shaler in particular has noted within the phenomenological tradition, but only with maybe a couple registers, Levinas in another framework. So, okay. So I don't want to say that there's no relation to any otherness. There is, but what kind of otherness is it, and how does it give itself? And that, I think, we find so in the moral emotions work, okay. So let me use the example of the example I gave of hope is one example in which we're both related to an object of hope, but also something is given as a ground of hope that allows that which I'm intending to be sustainable in a way that's not given in a perceptual experience. In the example of, well, we have a different example in humility, and a different example in trust. So that, I think, a really good example of the relation between trust and reliability. Reliability, I want to see if it gets at the same point. I just want to make sure that it gets at the same point that you're asking. If I experience, well, I think we have different objects, but they're not objects because it's a relation of a person to person in the case of trust. Whereas it's there goes a light bulb. Person to person in the case of trust, whereas reliability concerns a functional practicality. If my car, to use the same example as last week, if I take my car as reliable, it's because I've had a present experience of it. It's retained in its past as past. It's retained, and that couplet protends a future on which I count more or less based on my past and my present past. And that whole relation of what's given in the future as anticipatable is grounded in my present past experience. In the case of trust, you can have a relation with another in which I have had no previous contact, or I can trust a complete stranger, or I can have had disappointing relations with a particular person all the time and trust. So it has a completely different structure because what is given is also not an object. The other person is not an object. It's an unfolding, of a creative source of acts and so on and so on. So I think we're not dealing with those same issues and the same structure precisely because what's given is different, is a different quality. The other question that you're implying, though, I think or I see an implication of another question. Marion, for example, will describe something that he's called a poor phenomenon. And for him, the poor phenomenon, well, is precisely that. It's not saturated. It's deficient in a certain way. And I won't go into this now, although I did try to come to terms with that in an article I'd written before, but because it's a troubling thing, what's the relationship between in different terminology, the presentational structure of experience and vertical modes of experience. And contrary to what Mariona is implying, I don't see anything wrong with a presentational experience. As a matter of fact, it's not deficient in any way, if it's allowed to open up beyond itself. So I can experience the cup, the water, the chair, the pots and pans, as pots and pans and utensils, but from this other perspective, they're seen so that they have that presentational quality to them. They're given in this way. They have a front side and a back side. I can turn on the light and see them better. We can all look at them. We can all use them. And they give themselves in this corporeal, that's not a matter of the corporeal so much, but in these ways in which we can explore and have an intersubjective verification, use value. That's their structure and that's their value. But they can also open up in and through themselves to others who made them, to the holy, in the case of Teresa of Avila, where she says, that God is among the pots and pans, in their very usefulness, in their very articulation. And so I don't see that has to do with this vertical, what I call the delimitation, D-limitation of those very products or objects that also, in and through giving themselves in a certain way, also give more than themselves. And that's why they're not simply poor. And it's not simply a matter of, well, gee, I'm just not taking the cup. The cup can't be any more than the cup. But although it can point beyond itself, I mean, Marx's critique of objects and the fetishization of objects. We're stuck again.
I'm hearing you, but the image is frozen. I don't know. Now we can hear.
Final point about Marx was also, in his way, without any religious concepts or categories, pointing out the way in which reducing the object to itself also diminishes the object. So if it were merely functional or merely, well, also a matter of exchange value, but merely an object without seeing all the other intersubjective or interpersonal or interhuman relations to it, there's a kind of deficiency in the very presentation of what it is. So one could even just look at something like that and see the richness of the field of experience that is not accounted for simply in a model of presentation, even though, of course, we have a model of presentational givenness. For me, it's just been a matter that we've focused exclusively in phenomenology, almost exclusively, on that one mode of givenness and given great details of understandings of those things in terms of the way in which the kinesthetic, our kinesthetic relations, the affective lure of the object, all of these things are extremely rich and dynamic, and we've paid so much attention to those that we think that it's the only mode of givenness, and then we start to interpret all experiences in light of that structure. And then we can't get to them, and then they remain on the limit of experience, or we say they don't exist, or we can't talk about them meaningfully. And I think we can, and certain figures have, without being a matter of speculation in the past. I mean, we in the 20th century, we've seen other phenomenological figures in particular not go into theology, as opposed to Janico, not go into theology, not go into speculation, but given phenomenological descriptions of experiences that are different from that one mode of experience.
Thank you. Well, yeah, if I can follow a little bit. It's the same issue. I have difficulties to deal with Scheller, because he claims also that values are given before the object is given as such. Something like that. And I find much more compelling the Husserlian approach to value that claims that values or value properties are always value properties of things, states of affairs, persons, and such.
But that's Shaler's point too, I think, actually.
Okay.
But on that point, on this issue of of Husserl, Husserl was also beginning to describe, I shouldn't say beginning because they're already in the 20s and earlier, but in the 30s. I say beginning because it's in volume 42 of the Husserliana. But Husserl was describing in very sketchy ways the necessity of giving an account of persons, and at least implicitly dealing with modalities of experience that have to be re-understood in light of the interpersonal structure. And this is why he availed himself, which I like right now a lot. I mean, in other words, I find it meaningful, the expression of the ought, or the absolute ought. And this was in concert with the notion of the call, mm-hmm. and calling. So a Ruf and Berufung in Husserl. And this wasn't a matter of necessity. It wasn't a matter of duty, but he used the term sollen. It's a absolute sollen. And so this is already a sensitivity to a different language, or to experiences that demand the formulation of new concepts to be true to those experiences. And that's basically the necessity I see of these vertical experiences, that's what they're doing.
Can I jump in for a second on this comment? I'm curious to know what you think about the role of awakening in this geography. So, the ought and the calling in relation to the Ishvahe, in relation to the I that awakes in front of the passive synthesis, this intentionality that he calls sometimes gefühls Intentionalität. How would you envision this Ishvahe in relation to the soul? And yeah.
Okay, so I would say that there's a kind. Is that right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. I would say there is, within the structure of the passive synthesis, mm-hmm. broadly speaking, the kinesthesis that's operative there, and the structure of the affective allure, mm-hmm. and the perceiver, that this is still a structure that remains more or less one of my efforts. Now, not that I control it, not that I master it, not that I constitute it, but it's still within this reciprocal negotiating, if you wanted to use that term, structure. It's true that what's novel about it for us, reading earlier Husserl to later Husserl, what's novel about it is that it's not a subject-object structure. No. It's a co-emergent, I love that term, constitutive duet. It's a co-emergent, active, noesis, noematic structure. So that, and so he's struggling with the question, is sense constituted such that it's neutral and can acquire an affective allure or something like that? Is a unity of sense in it? Or does the unity of sense only arise in and through the affective allure that's exerted, as it were, on a perceiver who perceives and constitutes in this unity of sense? And he winds up opting for the latter at a certain point, at least in the passive synthesis text, where he's going back and forth. And whether he's 100% clear, that's a whole other question. But what makes sense to him for the most part in those analyses ultimately is that it's this structure that exercises an allure, and we're not going to get a unity of sense in a neutral way. Okay, now that's still a structure in which either if it's an eidetic object or it doesn't matter, so it doesn't have to be just perceptual, but that's still more or less one of managing, or there's all different terms we could use: provocation, negotiation, dialectical, I don't even know if it's really dialectical, but something like that. So the question is, in this other experience of the call, and interestingly, as you suggest, Husserl says in this text, I forget what object it was, like a chair or something like that, something calls out to me, and he uses the term calls out. So would that be the same thing as this other kind of call? And I would say no, it's not. Because in the provocation, either on the side of the object or the side of the subject, to pursue the object further, it's an epistemic quest, ultimately. That's one thing. Secondly, it avails itself to, if not causality, or if not even necessity, certain kinds of possibilities, like enticing possibilities, open possibilities, but also the structure of motivation. The structure of the ought, and especially, now there can be, so I distinguished three, I found three ways in which he used the term, although he didn't distinguish three clearly. There's a what he calls a practical ought, and that has an if-then structure. That might be a motivational structure. Like, if I do this, then I do that, or if I want this done, I need to do that. It can be superseded by another way in which I can do it better. It can be, so it can be overcome like that. Then there's something that he doesn't call, but this is maybe an inadequate name, but nevertheless, what I would call a praxical ought. And in that case, there are certain spiritual oughts that might be like reading Shakespeare, level of spirit. Ought has to do with doing, but not for any end. And I mean, so one can read Shakespeare not because it's good for me, but because of the inherent value of Shakespeare. I can go for a walk, not for any particular end. So it has a different kind of ought. It has an internal. Then there's what he calls an absolute ought. Mm-hmm. And that's what's peculiar to loving, we'll say. Mm-hmm. It's peculiar to the personal presence, and it's peculiar to a vocational experience. Mm-hmm. And that has to do with what's maybe compelling who I become, but it's not compelled. It's not, and he distinguishes it from duty. So he's distinguishing it from a kind of Kantian sense. Mm-hmm. And it's not, merely possible. So these kinds of, if you want to call them lures, or these kinds of experiences have a different tenor to them than the effective allure of an object. Mm-hmm. And they may be unmotivated, or they're, essentially creative of personal becoming. So they have a different structure. And this is a testimony, to go back to Esteban's question as well, to an attempt to discern different structures of experience, even if he's working them out, Husserl is, that do not comply or do not conform strictly to, let's say, kinesthetic order of experience.
Yeah. Just to know, is there any place where we can read more about it? Yeah.
In Husserl, you mean, or?
Yeah, Husserl and your digression of it.
So, Husserl would be volume 42 of the Husserliana, mm-hmm. But that's a new edited edition is. Well, as in all edited editions now, they can be scattered, but they're so nicely documented, and the index, not just the index, but all the table of contents, that you can find your way through. But I have another manuscript that's out. I won't say any more right now. It's called Limit Phenomena and Phenomenology. And that particular piece on the absolute ought is the concluding one, but it traces through the notions. Some of these things I've worked through previously, but I've redone them as more of a coherent work on the problem of limit phenomena, the problem of generative method in relationship to that within Husserl. This is just within Husserl, and then the other question on individuation and vocation, so the absolute ought. So within Husserl.
Yeah,
So, I don't know. It's under review. It's out. It's under review right now. Who knows? But so in any case, that would, maybe within a year.
Great.
But that's for that. The other works are in process at the moment. But
yeah, it would be very helpful to have all of it together and follow your thread and see what kind of implications this has. So thank you very much for this talk. Thank you to the people who joined us today. I don't know if among the people that are connected online now, there are anybody who wants to ask a final question before we close.
I'm happy to respond to whoever, if they have something.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Yeah.
I wasn't. Thank you very much. We are very glad you included me.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Really, it was very generous of you to share this time with us.
I would like to thank you too, both of you, for doing this. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank
you.
So, Ferrarella for the invitation also on hosting this conference.
My pleasure. It's really my pleasure to be.
Thank you very much for organizing all this. It takes a lot of work, a lot of organizational trouble.
We have excellent material to discuss. So thank you very much, and I hope to meet all of you soon and continue this dialogue together.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.